Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to psychology. Let's start this with a little quiz. So, true or false? Students learn best when teaching styles are matched to their learning style. In other words, if someone is a visual learner or a kinesthetic learner, that they learn best when material is presented in that way to them. True or false? False. Research shows that people do not learn better when information is only presented to them in their preferred learning style. Instead, what research shows is that all people benefit from having information presented to them in multiple different ways. True or false? Birds of a feather flock together. So, is it that people who are more similar are more likely to form bonds? Or is it the idea that opposites attract? Well, this is actually true. Birds of a feather do tend to flock together. When people share different beliefs and other things that bind them together, they're more likely to form a relationship. How about this? Lie detector tests are accurate. True or false? This is false. Lie detector tests are supposed to measure physiological reactions and can detect if someone is telling a lie, that there's somehow their physiology reaction is different. But research shows that this is not the case. They are not very accurate at all. And if they do make a mistake, they're more likely to make a mistake where it's someone who is telling the truth. It indicates that they are lying. But lie detector tests are still kind of a trope that's used in television and movies. And because of this, people have a lot more faith in their reliability than they really should. How about this? True or false? Money brings us happiness. Well, this is true. Well, at least to an extent. So it is true that with more money there is more happiness, but there's a limit to this. Once a person gets to a point where they no longer have to worry about money, where they're not worrying about what their expenses are and they can pay for all the things they need to, then we start to see a diminishing return on where just increasing amounts of monies don't then keep bringing the same levels of joy following that. So this is true up to a point when a person is then completely financially comfortable. How about this? People often repress traumatic childhood memories. True or false? This is false. So there was a kind of panic that happened decades ago where all of a sudden people were remembering these repressed memories of past trauma. And so, therefore, there was a lot of research that was done on this. And generally, what we found was is that memories got were being implanted in how questions were being asked to individuals. Our memories are not perfect. They can be malleable. And the way someone asks you questions can actually color and change what your memories are. How about this? True or false? People only use 10% of their brain. This is false. Even though this is something that once again is often mentioned in kind of in television or movies, we do use all of our brain. The whole myth of using 10% of your brain, no one even knows exactly where it came from. There's some ideas that it came from an early advertisement 100 years ago, some kind of comments that were maybe made by an early psychologist, or maybe even some early brain research where they couldn't positively identify the function of certain parts of the brain. But now that we have modern research techniques that can look at the activity of the brain, we see that people use all of their brain. Even when they were asleep or in a coma, we are still utilizing all of our brain. Now, there are definitely different parts of the brain that will become more or less active, but we still use all of our brain. How about this? True or false? There is no evidence that ESP exists. So that extrasensory perception. True. So a lot of research has been done over the years. Honestly, not as much now because this is something that's seen as kind of a settled question. But there was a great deal of research that was done decades ago trying to figure out whether or not there is something called ESP out there. And what was found was that when you have a truly controlled environment, and you do rigorous studies around this, that there's just no evidence that ESP exists. How about this? It is best to stick to your initial intuition on multiple choice questions. In other words, if you answered B on a multiple choice test and then you said, oh, maybe it's C, should you stick with your original answer or should you change your answer? So, is it best to stick with that initial answer that you chose on a multiple choice question? So, this is actually false. So, research shows that you will get more questions correct by changing your answer than you will by keeping your answer. Now, there are definitely opportunities when people will have the correct answer and they will change it to a wrong answer. And those tend to stick in your memory more because that's kind of a bigger um, negative. And so those stand out in your memory. And so therefore you don't want to do that in the future because you're like, oh, I remember doing that once and that caused me to miss the question. But on average, you are more likely to change your answer from a wrong one to a correct one than to change it from a correct one to a wrong one. True or false? People who have psychological disorders are more prone to violence. This is false. While people with psychological disorders can be violent, they are no more violent than the general population, or the percentage of people with the psychological disorders who are violent is no more than the percentage of people in the general population who are violent. But once again, much like in the previous example, media reports a news report of somebody who has a psychological disorder who committed an act of violence is very salient, and so therefore we are more likely to remember that, and we see these small little pieces of anecdotal evidence as opposed to looking at the overall picture of what the overall percentages are. How about this? Psychological disorders are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. True or false? This is false. So, this is a very simplistic way that kind of misunderstands the way that the brain functions and the neurochemicals that are in the brain. And this probably largely comes from the ideas that people have around the treatments of depression and that you take drugs that often increase the amounts of serotonin in the brain. And so, therefore, people have this idea that being depressed means that you don't produce enough serotonin. But that's not actually what's going on. The neurochemicals in the brain, and while yes, these drugs do cause an increase or decrease in the amounts of neurochemicals, at least initially, they're part of a much more complex system. And by altering the balance of a neurochemical, you're really affecting the interconnectedness of the neurons in the brain and how they are communicating with each other. So it's not simply about pouring more or taking away some chemical in the brain to solve a psychological disorder. Instead, it's really about how that fits into this larger, more complex network in the brain. So, this is just meant to be kind of a teaser for things that we're going to discuss, or the types of things that you might learn throughout the semester. And while you might know some of those, I'm hoping that maybe you learn some new things, and maybe over the course of the semester you'll learn some new things as well.